Hi, this is Miss Eglin with Middle School Language Arts, and today I'm going to be reading an adapted version of Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death. Our objective is we want to be able to describe how illustrations can help us understand not only the characters, but the settings and plot of a story. So without further ado, and again, this is not the original version, but this is a shorter version adapted by David E. Cutts and illustrated by John Lawn. I'll try to show you some of the pictures here as I read. The Red Death had spread throughout the land. No disease had ever been so awful. Blood was its sign, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness. The skin bled heavily until death came, and it all took place within half an hour. Great numbers had already died. But Prince Prospero was happy and fearless and wise. He called together 1,000 healthy knights and ladies. With these friends, he retired to the safety of one of his castles in the country. The castle was huge and magnificent, the creation of the prince's own strange taste. A strong, high wall encircled it. The gates were made of iron, and after the prince and the guest had entered, servants brought out torches and hammers. They welded shut the doors. They made sure it would be impossible to get in or out. The castle had food and supplies to last a long time. With such precautions, those inside might defy the disease. The outside world would have to take care of itself. In the meantime, it was foolish to be sad. The prince had provided everything that was needed for pleasure. There were clowns, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians. There were delicious things to eat and drink and look upon. Safety was inside. Outside was the Red Death. 5 or 6 months had passed since the guests had retreated into the castle. Outside, the plague raged more furiously than ever. But safe in the castle, Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball. This ball was of the most unusual magnificence. The masquerade was held in 7 rooms. Each room opened into the next. In many palaces, such rooms form a long and straight line, giving a view of all the rooms at once. But here, the rooms were arranged so little more than one could be seen at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a new effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, was a tall, narrow window. These windows were stained glass, and the color of each was the same color of the room. The room at one end of the suite, for example, was blue, and bright blue were its windows. The next 5 rooms were purple, green, orange, white, and violet. In the 7th room, black drapes hung over the ceiling and down the walls. They fell in heavy folds upon a black velvet carpet. Only in this room did the color of the windows differ from the walls. Here, the panes were scarlet, a deep blood color. A fire burned outside each window of the suite. The flickering flames shined through the tinted glass and lit each room. This made many fantastic designs upon the walls. But in the black room, the effect was ghastly. It produced so strange a look upon the faces of those who entered that few people were bold enough to go there. In this room, there was also a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung back and forth with a dull, heavy clang. When the minute hand went around the face and the hour was struck, there came from the clock a sound that was clear and loud and deep. It was such a strange sound that the musicians stopped playing and the dancers stopped dancing. For a brief moment, everyone seemed troubled. As the chimes of the clock rang, the most light-hearted guests grew pale, while the older and more serious guests passed their hands over their brows in confused thought. But when the echoes of the clock's chimes stopped, laughter spread through the group at once. The musicians had looked at each other and smiled at their own nervousness. They told themselves that the next chiming of the clock would not affect them the same way. But after 60 minutes, the same silence fell over the group. Nevertheless, it was a lively and magnificent party. When it came to decorating, the taste of the prince was quite unusual. He ignored traditional fashion. His own ideas about color and special effects were bold and glowed with a fiery light. Although some would have thought him mad, his guests thought that he was not. The prince's choice of costumes for his masquerade was also very strange. There were ghosts and phantoms, deformed figures, and unusual fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the bizarre, some of the terrible, and even some that caused disgust. Moving within the 7 rooms, there seemed to be 1,000 dreams and fantasies, and these dreams twisted in and about, reflecting the colors of the rooms. The wild music of the orchestra seemed to echo their steps. And again, from the Hall of Velvet, the ebony clock strikes, and then for a moment all is still, all is silent, but the voice of the clock. The guests freeze with fear, but the echoes of the chime fades, and the music begins. The dancers go on more merrily than before. Now no one enters the black velvet room. The night grows late, and a more reddish light flows through the blood-covered panes. The blackness of the draperies is frightening, and to him whose foot falls upon the carpet, there comes from the ebony clock a muffled sound. It is more solemn than any sound which reaches their ears in the other rooms. But these other rooms were crowded with people, and the heart of life beat feverishly within them. And the party went on until at last there began the sounding of the clock at midnight. Then the music stopped. All was uneasy while the chiming of the bell went on. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded. There was more time for the guests to gaze fearfully about. Before the last echoes of the last chime had sunk into silence, many in the crowd had noticed a certain figure whom no one had seen before. The guests began to whisper in disapproval, then in terror, in horror, in disgust, for the costume of the figure in question had gone beyond the bounds of good taste, even for this masquerade. The figure was tall and thin and shrouded from head to foot in the garments of the grave. The mask that hid the face looked like a stiffened corpse. All this might have been accepted, but the stranger had gone too far. He had assumed the look of the Red Death. His clothing was splattered with blood, and all the features of his face were sprinkled with the scarlet horror. He walked slowly and solemnly among the dancers, as if acting out his role. When Prince Prospero saw this ghostly figure, he shuddered, even in terror, either in terror or in distaste, and then his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares insult us with this awful mockery?" demanded the prince. "Seize him, unmask him, that we may know whom to hang at sunrise." The prince stood in the blue room as he uttered these words. His voice rang through all 7 rooms, for he was bold and strong, and the music had stopped at the waving of his hand. At the prince's side stood a group of guests and servants. They made a slight movement toward the strange intruder, but then stopped as if filled with dread. Now the stranger drew nearer the prince, moving with slow, silent steps, but no one put forth a hand to seize him. The ghostly figure passed within an arm's length of the prince. Then, while everyone shrank back toward the walls, he made his way slowly and deliberately from room to room. He passed from the blue to the purple room, then into the green, then into the orange, white, and violet, while no one made a movement to stop him. Then, burning with rage and waving a dagger in the air, Prince Prospero rushed through the rooms. No one followed because of the deadly terror that had seized them all. The prince caught up with the dreadful figure at the far end of the black velvet room. Suddenly, the stranger turned and faced him. There was a sharp cry, and the prince's shining dagger dropped upon the carpet. Instantly, Prince Prospero fell to the floor dead. Then, gathering their last bit of courage, the guests rushed into the black room. The ghostly intruder stood straight and motionless in the shadow of the ebony clock. The guests seized him and gasped in horror. The burial clothes and the corpse-like mask, which they tore violently away, were worn by no one at all. Now the presence of the Red Death was known. He had come like a thief in the night. One by one, the guests dropped in the bloody halls and died where they fell. And the clock stopped when the last of the guests was dead, and the fires died out, and darkness and decay and the Red Death ruled over all. The end.